Okay, so this is the last of the lectures on adolescence. The last one we ended up talking about relationships with parents, and this one we'll talk about relationship with peers and briefly about childhood or juvenile delinquency, and maybe a little bit more about sex during adolescence. When we were talking about relationship with parents, one of the things that we noted was how during this time we begin, or young adolescents begin to turn away from their parents and towards their peer group, right? Well, there's a couple important concepts to understand when we talk about peer group. Peer groups are what social scientists call a reference group, and what happens during adolescence is the most important people that influence are beginning to be one of the more important groups to influence our sense of self is our reference group, because we make what is referred to as social comparisons. And it's not terribly useful when a parent says, well, yeah, but consider how the starving children in Sudan. That's not relevant. It's not significant to an adolescent, excuse me, who is comparing themselves with their peer group and their reference groups. And then your books, some textbooks talk about different kinds of reference groups. You have your crowd, and then your clique. So your crowd might be all of the all of the academically minded people, but your clique is defined as 2 to 12 people. It's fun to sometimes to talk about what groups you ran with. I called the group that I was a part of. We were the squares and the eggheads, right? We weren't nerds. There was a difference between being a nerd. But anyway, to think back to which group. And then, when you've been out of high school as long as I have, it's fun to look at those old pictures and see who's still communicating with who and like, what group was I with? Okay, moving on. And then there's also a brief discussion about different levels of popularity. And there's your book makes reference to something called a controversial adolescent, a rejected adolescent, and neglected adolescent. So the controversial adolescent, they're the ones that are liked by some but disliked by some. So they're controversial, right? They're some people like them, some people don't. The rejected adolescents are like actively disliked, right? And then the neglected adolescent, they're neither liked nor disliked. They're simply nobody really even knows who they are. They're just generally overlooked, right? And I suspect that most of us are probably the controversial. We had friends, and then we had people that probably didn't like us. Juvenile delinquency. Now, this is an interesting and sometimes shows up on a quiz question, and that is there is some evidence that suggests that the younger a person is when they begin to engage, and in this case, we're talking about delinquent behavior as breaking the rules, right, or deviant behavior. The younger that they are when they begin to engage in this behavior, the more severe it will be. So it's not uncommon it's pretty common for an adolescent to have a brief period of rule breaking. Maybe they engage in a little bit of shoplifting, or they sneak alcohol into the school dance, just a little bit, once or twice, just to get a taste. But when that starts really young and it's a violent kind of thing, like killing the cats and torturing the frogs, then there is some evidence that that will continue, right? So there's also this notion of the unsocialized delinquent versus the socialized delinquent. So the socialized delinquent is thought as somebody who engages in this delinquent behavior because of their peer group, right? So they've learned it, they learned these norms. It's a simple phase. It's influenced by peers. Their peers will move past it. They'll get a different group. They'll try it out. Remember, because adolescence is about experimentation, trying out new things, as opposed to the unsocialized delinquent. And this is one that has a limited amount of parental influence. There aren't other social forces regulating or controlling that deviant behavior. So again, my sense or my speculation would be that I think about some of my, and maybe delinquent behaviors. They would have been socialized. They would have been for a brief period. In my youth, I did things we weren't supposed to do, and then that passed. And then finally, the last slide just offers some statistics about or in some words, right, or some terms. One thing that I don't want to not address is what we refer to as the sexual double standard. And the sexual double standard is simply the fancy way of saying that that boys are allowed to be more promiscuous, to be more sexually active than girls. There's a concept, it's called the principle of threes. I don't know if it still is a thing, but it certainly used to be. And the principle of threes said that because of this double standard, a boy would multiply that when asked how many sexual partners they had had, a boy would multiply their partners by 3 to make themselves seem cooler, right? But a girl would divide the number of partners that they had by 3. So a boy would say he had 3 when he had 1, and a girl would say she had 1 when in fact she had 3, part of the sexual double standard. There's also reference in here to virginity pledges, and what the research tells us about virginity pledges is that they don't work, right? But these are they're intended to be a public commitment that somebody will remain a sexual virgin until they are married. And the statistics say is that when people make those pledges, that as a pattern in the data, they may delay sexual intercourse. But as I said in the first lecture associated with this chapter, what the research does tell us is the more we know, the more young people know about sex, the sooner they will engage in it. That has been presented, that has been supported by the data, by counting. But when they engage in it, the more they know, the safer they will be, the more likely they will be to use safe sex practices. And the data on the aggregate data on virginity pledges says that they may in fact delay sexual activity, but not necessarily engage in safer sexual practices. And then this wraps up our chapter on adolescence. Look for the forum posts and the quiz and any other little activities. And the next chapter we'll pick up on will be emerging adulthood or young adulthood.